To this day, the world repeats a story written not by history, but by propaganda. A story crafted by later Islamic chroniclers who declared Arabia before Islam to be an age of Jahiliyya, an age of ignorance, darkness, and superstition. But this narrative is false. Before Islam, Arabia was not ignorant. Arabia was not lost. Arabia was not a desert without civilization. Arabia was a crossroads. Arabia was a refuge. Arabia was multicultural. Like the West today, Arabia gave sanctuary to those fleeing persecution. It allowed voices that empires silenced to breathe again. And in its tolerance, it became a civilization built not on empire, but on coexistence. To understand Arabia, we must see the world around it. The Roman Byzantine Empire to the northwest, the Persian Sassanid Empire to the northeast. Both were mighty, cultured, advanced, but also brutal in their suppression of dissent. In Byzantium, heresy was death. Christians who challenged the imperial church faced exile, torture, or execution. Jews were marginalized. Philosophers who questioned doctrine were silenced. In Persia, the Sassanids enforced Zoroastrian orthodoxy with fire and sword. Alternative beliefs, like Manichaeism, were hunted down and destroyed. But Arabia was different. Arabia had no emperor, no centralized church, no inquisition. Arabia was fragmented into tribes and towns, yes. But in that fragmentation lay freedom. And so Arabia became a buffer zone, a space between empires where the persecuted found shelter. Among those who found sanctuary here were the Jews. When Rome destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, waves of Jews scattered across the Near East. Some reached Arabia. Yathrib, the oasis city later renamed Medina, became home to powerful Jewish tribes, the Banu Kainuka, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza. They were farmers, cultivating dates in Yathrib's fertile soil. They were merchants, controlling trade networks. They were scholars, preserving scripture. Here in Arabia, they were free. No emperor decreed how they must worship. No soldiers stormed their synagogues. They lived as neighbors to Arabs, intermarrying, trading, disputing, but surviving. Yathrib was not an age of ignorance. It was an age of refuge. Christianity, too, found a home in Arabia. Najran, in the south, became one of the great Christian centers of the peninsula. Churches stood tall, monks wrote gospels, and pilgrims came from afar. These were not only Orthodox Christians loyal to Byzantium, but also sects branded heretical in Europe. In Byzantium, these sects were hunted. In Arabia, they thrived. Arabia's northern fringes were touched by Ghassanid Arabs allied to Rome. Monks travelled with caravans. Hymns echoed in desert air. Arabia did not care whether a Christian was Orthodox or heretic. Arabia cared only whether a man respected his neighbor's way of life. Among Arabia's most mysterious communities were the Sabians. Later, Islamic texts would acknowledge them as people of the book. Their faith was bound to the stars, to prayer cycles, to ancient scripture older than Muhammad himself. Where Byzantium dismissed them, Arabia gave them space. Here they gazed at the heavens without fear. Here they lived as one of many voices in a pluralist choir. Zoroastrians, with their eternal fires, found space in Arabia's eastern settlements. Hajar, Yamama, Bahrain. Manichaeans, whose prophet Mani had been executed in Persia, also fled here. Arabia gave them shelter when their own empire gave them death. In Arabia, the fire altars burned not in fear, but in freedom. And then there were Arabia's own seekers, the Hanifs. They rejected the tribal shrines and searched for a purer monotheism. They were not persecuted. They were not silenced. They were tolerated. Arabia allowed even those who questioned tradition to wander freely. This was not ignorance. This was intellectual liberty. Arabia was dotted with sanctuaries called Kaabas, houses of representation. The most famous was the Kaaba in Mecca, but others existed in Taif, in Najran, in Dumat al-Jandal, in Yemen. Inside them were symbols of worship, crosses, tribal emblems, astral tokens, sacred stones. Not idols, but sacred signs, like the Christian cross, the Hindu Om, or the Muslim black stone today. These cabals were parliaments of faith. By housing many symbols, they guaranteed peace among tribes. No one was excluded. Every faith had a place. This was Arabia before Islam, a land of caravans, of markets, of poetry, of trade, incense from Yemen, spices from India, silk from Persia, gold from Africa, all passed through Arabia's hands. Along with goods came ideas, stories, and beliefs. It was not superstition, it was civilization. But tolerance is fragile. Arabia's strength was its weakness. Its openness allowed many to thrive, but it also allowed those who would not coexist but only demand surrender. When Muhammad arrived in Yathrib, he came not as a conqueror but as a refugee. He was welcomed. He was given protection. He was entrusted as an arbitrator. But soon tolerance turned to silence. Coexistence gave way to surrender, and Arabia's pluralism would collapse. Before Islam, Arabia was a haven of voices. After Islam, it would be reduced to one. This is the story of how a multicultural civilization was usurped. The story of how coexistence became surrender. To understand the heart of multiculturalist Arabia, we must enter its sanctuaries. The Arabs called them cabals, sacred enclosures, houses of representation. Each was more than a shrine. Each was a covenant, a visible treaty. They were the beating hearts of a civilization that thrived on plurality. A civilization where every tribe, every faith, every culture had its place. And the greatest of them all was the Kaaba of Mecca. The Kaaba was not an idol house, as later history would claim. It was a parliament. Inside its walls were symbols of worship, sacred representations of tribes and peoples from across Arabia and beyond. The god Hubal, symbol of Quraysh authority, stood here. But so too did the three daughters of the high god, Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. Beside them, tokens of South Arabian deities, astral markers linked to Sabian rites, even crosses and relics from Christians and Jews who saw Mecca as neutral ground. This was the genius of the Kaaba. It was not exclusive, it was inclusive. A space where every community could see itself represented, respected, acknowledged. Like a modern parliament, where each flag stands in assembly, the Kaaba was the chamber of Arabia's pluralism. Every year, during the sacred months, tribes converged on Mecca. They brought offerings to their symbols of worship, honored their ancestors, and renewed tribal covenants. But more than worship, it was politics. By placing a symbol in the Kaaba, a tribe declared, "We belong. We are represented. We are part of Arabia's sacred order." By tolerating all symbols, Mecca declared, "You are safe here. Your voice matters. Your God is honored alongside ours." The Kaaba was not just stone and cloth. It was the constitution of coexistence. Mecca's Kaaba was the most famous, but Arabia was filled with cabals. In Taif, the sanctuary of Allat stood in a city of gardens and poets. In Najran, Christians built churches alongside Arabian cabals. In Duma al-Jandal, traders worshipped in a Kaaba that linked Syria to Arabia's heart. In Yemen, temples rose in Sheba and Himyar, where incense smoke mixed with prayers to many gods, and later to Christ and Yahweh. Each Kaaba was a node in Arabia's network of pluralism. Each Kaaba declared this land belongs not to one god, but to many voices. Later, Islam would brand these as idols, dismissing them as relics of ignorance. But they were no different from the sacred symbols we still cherish today: the cross in Christianity, the rosary in Catholic devotion, the statues of Mary and Jesus, the Om in Hinduism, the Wheel of Dharma in Buddhism, the Black Stone in Islam, the Zamzam well, the stoning ritual of Hajj, the prayer beads of every faith. Symbols of worship are the universal language of spirituality. Arabia's Kaabals were simply galleries of this language, open, diverse, and inclusive. The Quraysh, custodians of the Kaaba, understood the politics of neutrality. By protecting the Kaaba and all its symbols, they became the guardians of Arabia's pluralist order. They ensured peace during the sacred months. They guaranteed that pilgrims could come without fear. They profited from the trade, yes, but they also protected the balance. Mecca was not a theocracy. It was a neutral ground. Its power came not from conquest, but from coexistence. The pilgrimage to the Kaaba was not only a religious act, it was a festival of Arabia. Poets competed in verse, merchants exchanged goods from Africa, India, and Persia. Musicians performed, disputes were settled, alliances were forged. The Kaaba was the heartbeat of Arabia, spiritual, economic, political, cultural. It was where tribes laid down arms and renewed peace. This was not ignorance. This was civilization. But such representation is fragile. It requires respect from all. It requires a commitment to coexistence. And in time, voices would arise that no longer wanted coexistence, but demanded surrender. Voices that would not tolerate a parliament of faiths, but sought a throne for one. The Kaabals of Arabia, once houses of inclusion, would become the first targets of usurpation. The Kaabals of Arabia were the visible proof of a multicultural world, a world where symbols united tribes, where sanctuaries guaranteed peace, where difference was tolerated. But in the story that followed, these symbols would be shattered, these Kaabals destroyed, this pluralism erased, and the greatest parliament of coexistence, the Kaaba itself, would be usurped into exclusivity. In the story of multiculturalist Arabia, no land shines brighter than Yemen. While Mecca's Kaaba drew pilgrims and merchants, Yemen was the jewel of the peninsula. Prosperous, advanced, multicultural. Its mountains were terraced gardens. Its valleys flowed with rivers. Its ports connected Africa, India, and the Mediterranean. This was the Arabia of legend, the Arabia of Sheba. And in Yemen's story, we see both the brilliance of multicultural civilization and the tragedy of what happens when usurpation erases identity. Long before Mecca rose to prominence, Yemen was the heart of Arabian civilization. Here flourished the great South Arabian kingdoms: Sheba, Hadramaut, Kataban, Himyar. Sheba, or Saba, was famed, even in biblical lore. Its queen traveled to Jerusalem to meet Solomon, bearing gold and incense. These kingdoms built vast irrigation systems like the Great Marib Dam, channeling water into fertile fields. They raised monumental temples, carved inscriptions, and created some of Arabia's earliest written alphabets. This was not desert ignorance. This was statecraft. This was engineering. This was culture. Yemen's prosperity came from incense, frankincense and myrrh, sacred resins that burned in temples across the world. Egyptian priests used them in ritual, Roman emperors demanded them for sacrifices, Indian kings prized them in worship. The incense routes stretched from Yemen through Arabia to the Mediterranean. Mecca's caravans relied on them. But Yemen was the source, the land where prosperity was perfumed with smoke. Yemen's greatness was not only wealth, but openness. Its ports at Aden and Socotra welcomed ships from across the seas. From Africa came ivory and gold. From India came spices, cotton and pearls. From Persia came silk and carpets. From Rome came glass and wine. Yemen's markets were mosaics of culture. Its cities thrived on diversity. Its temples, and later its churches and synagogues, reflected its pluralist fabric. This was Arabia's cosmopolitan south, an ancient version of what today we call globalization. In Yemen, religions coexisted for centuries. The early kingdoms worshipped Al-Makka, the moon god, and Athtar, the star deity. Their symbols stood in monumental temples. But over time, Judaism took root in Himyar. Christianity spread into Najran. Both thrived side by side under Yemen's pluralist rule. Najran became a Christian stronghold, its churches filled with hymns. Himyar's kings at times embraced Judaism, allowing their people to live by Torah. Yemen was not bound to one faith. It was bound to freedom of faith. But tolerance was never without tension. In the 6th century, Himyar's king, Yusuf du Nuwas, a convert to Judaism, persecuted the Christians of Najran. Thousands were killed in what became known as the Massacre of Najran. The event shocked the region. The Christian king of Ethiopia, Caleb, invaded Yemen in response, overthrowing Himyar's rule. This was Arabia's balance, fragile, always at risk when one faith sought to dominate another. But even so, Yemen rebuilt and pluralism endured. Yemen was not only wealthy, it was cultured. It gave the world one of the oldest alphabets, South Arabian script. Its artisans carved in alabaster, its poets recited verses that travelled with caravans. Its laws were written, its trade regulated, its people educated. Yemen was a cradle of Arabian civilization, a beacon in the desert. But even the greatest civilizations fall. In the late 6th century, the great Marib Dam collapsed. Fields dried, famine spread. Yemen's wealth began to wane. Persia intervened, taking control of southern Arabia. Foreign rule weakened local kingdoms, and then came Islam. What remained of Yemen's pluralism was absorbed into the new creed. Synagogues fell silent, churches crumbled. The incense trade was rerouted under Islamic control. Yemen, once a jewel of diversity, became another province in a rising empire. The story of Yemen is the story of what is lost when pluralism is usurped. From Sheba's golden terraces to Himyar's synagogues, from Najran's churches to Aden's ports, Yemen was once a beacon of multicultural civilization. But under conquest, its symbols were erased, its identity rewritten, its prosperity forgotten. Today, Yemen is among the poorest lands in the Middle East, torn by war, reduced to rubble, its golden past buried under the sands of neglect. What Islam called ignorance was in truth brilliance. What Islam called salvation was in truth erasure. Yemen was Arabia's crown. It proved that the desert was not barren, but fertile with culture. It proved that Arabia could be a center of civilization, not ignorance. But Yemen's story also warns us. Prosperity and pluralism, if unguarded, can be erased. And what remains is not the memory of greatness, but the silence of usurpation. Among Arabia's oases, None was as fertile, as peaceful, or as pluralist as Yathrib. Here Jews and Arabs lived side by side. Here farmers cultivated groves that fed the region. Here merchants traded freely, poets recited verses, and assemblies resolved disputes. Yathrib was not a desert backwater. It was a multicultural republic of tribes, faiths, and voices. But Yathrib's greatest strength, its tolerance, would also prove to be its downfall. For when tolerance becomes surrender, pluralism cannot survive. Yathrib was unique in Arabia. Unlike Mecca, which thrived on pilgrimage, Yathrib thrived on agriculture. Its Jewish tribes, Banu Kainuka, Banu Nadir, Banu Qurayza, had built advanced irrigation systems, cultivating vast date groves. Arab tribes, Aws and Khazraj, lived alongside them, sharing land, trade, and alliances. Religion did not divide Yathrib. Jews worshipped in synagogues, Arabs honoured their tribal symbols of worship, and reformist Hanifs wandered between. Yathrib was not bound by a single creed. It was bound by mutual agreements, treaties, and coexistence. Yathrib had a reputation across Arabia. It was a safe city, a place where the persecuted found protection. Unlike Rome or Persia, which crushed dissent, Yathrib opened its gates. Refugees fleeing tribal wars, merchants escaping Meccan boycotts, even spiritual reformers found safety here. Yathrib was the Arabia of asylum, a city that lived by the principle: your faith is your choice, your voice is protected, your life is safe among us. In the year 622, one such refugee arrived, Muhammad. Driven from Mecca after provoking tension with its pluralist order, Muhammad sought safety, and Yathrib, true to its spirit, welcomed him. They gave him protection. They gave him land. They gave him a role. Muhammad was invited not as a conqueror, but as an arbitrator, a neutral judge to settle disputes between Yathrib's Jewish and Arab tribes. It was the highest form of asylum, not only safety, but citizenship and even employment. To preserve harmony, Yathrib's tribes and Muhammad's followers drafted an agreement, later known as the Charter of Medina. It recognized each community as part of one city. Jews would live by their law, Muslims by theirs, Arabs by theirs. Each faith retained autonomy. In essence, it was a constitution of pluralism. But even here, seeds of imbalance were sown. For within the Charter, Muhammad was acknowledged as the final arbitrator. What was intended as neutrality would become monopoly. At first, Yathrib's pluralism continued. Jews taught Torah. Arabs kept their ancestral practices. Muslims prayed in their gathering place. But slowly, coexistence turned into confrontation. Muhammad began claiming not only authority, but supremacy. Disputes between communities were resolved in his favor. His revelations increasingly targeted Jews who resisted him. His followers grew in number, emboldened by the city's tolerance. Step by step, Yathrib's leaders gave ground. Each concession silenced another voice. Each compromise strengthened Muhammad's hand. Tolerance was mistaken for wisdom. But in truth, it was surrender. Soon, tolerance ended altogether. The Banu Kainuka were expelled after a market dispute. The Banu Nadir were driven into exile after refusing Muhammad's demands. And the Banu Qurayza faced the worst fate, besieged and then massacred. Yathrib's Jewish heritage, centuries old, was erased in a single generation. What began as refuge ended in domination. What began as coexistence ended in surrender. Yathrib, the multicultural city, ceased to exist. In its place rose Medina, the city of the Prophet. Its pluralism destroyed, its diversity silenced, its heritage rewritten. The refugees had become rulers, the asylum seekers had become lords, and the city that had welcomed them had surrendered itself into their hands. Yathrib teaches us a timeless lesson. Tolerance is noble. Coexistence is civilization. But when tolerance bends too far, it becomes surrender. The people of Yathrib believed they were preserving peace, but by caving to endless demands, they lost their voice. By yielding ground, they lost their freedom. The spirit that replaced coexistence was not peace, it was surrender. And from Yathrib, that spirit would spread to Mecca, to Arabia, and eventually across empires. Yathrib could have been the model of pluralism for the ages. Instead, it became the cautionary tale of how tolerance without defense is swallowed by domination. It welcomed refugees and created lords. It gave asylum and received usurpation. This was not coexistence, it was surrender. And in surrender, Yathrib lost itself forever. Mecca, the heart of Arabia. For centuries, the Kaaba stood as a parliament of faiths, housing symbols of worship from across the peninsula. It was not owned by one tribe, one creed, or one god. It was the covenant of coexistence. But once Yathrib surrendered to Muhammad, his eyes turned back to Mecca. What began in Medina became revolution in Mecca, and what followed was not coexistence, but usurpation. Muhammad had left Mecca as a refugee, rejected by its pluralist order. But with Medina under his control, he built power, militarily, economically, politically. His followers grew in number, emboldened by victories against Meccan caravans. The balance shifted. The refugee had become a rival power, and Mecca, once the guardian of neutrality, now stood in the path of his ambition. In the year 630, Muhammad marched on Mecca. But there was no great battle. Quraysh, weary of conflict, opened the gates. They surrendered their city to him without bloodshed. This was not the preservation of pluralism, it was the end of it. For once Muhammad entered Mecca, he did not preserve the Kaaba's inclusivity. He erased it. The Kaaba, once the Parliament of Arabia, became the throne of one creed. The symbols of worship, sacred representations of every tribe, were destroyed. The crosses were torn down, the emblems removed, the astral signs obliterated. In their place, only one remained: Muhammad's God, Allah. This was not coexistence. This was surrender imposed by force. The Kaaba ceased to be a parliament. It became a monopoly. The Kaaba was not abolished. It was rebranded. The sacred house of pluralism was rewritten as the house of one God. Its symbols erased, its rituals redefined, its history rewritten as ignorance. The same sanctuary that once welcomed all voices now silenced all but one. This was the usurpation of Mecca. But Mecca was only the beginning. Once the Kaaba was monopolized, all cabals across Arabia were targeted. In Taif, the sanctuary of Al-Lat was destroyed. In Najran, Christians faced increasing pressure until their churches crumbled. In Dumat al-Jandal, shrines that once united tribes fell silent. In Yemen, the temples of Sheba and Himyar were erased. The network of sanctuaries that sustained Arabia's pluralism was dismantled piece by piece. This was not the evolution of faith. It was the erasure of history. With Mecca under his control, Muhammad summoned tribes from across Arabia. One by one, they came. They were not invited to coexist. They were commanded to surrender. Those who resisted faced war. Those who complied handed over their symbols and accepted Muhammad's authority. This was the transformation of Arabia, from a land of pluralism to a land of submission. In just a few years, centuries of pluralism vanished. The Kaaba's parliament of faiths was destroyed. Yathrib's asylum was silenced. Yemen's prosperity was erased. Arabia was no longer a safe haven. It was no longer a land of many voices. It became the land of one voice, one creed, one narrative. This was not coexistence. This was surrender. This was usurpation. To secure its victory, Islam rewrote the past. All that came before was branded Jahiliyya, ignorance. The wisdom of Sheba, the scriptures of Yathrib's Jews, the churches of Najran, the sanctuaries of Taif, the poetry of Mecca, all dismissed as darkness. But this was not ignorance. It was identity. It was pluralism. It was civilization. What Islam called salvation was, in truth, erasure. Mecca once symbolized coexistence. Under Islam, it became the symbol of surrender. Arabia once thrived as a multicultural civilization. Under Islam, it was usurped into exclusivity. The usurpation of Mecca was not a spiritual revival. It was a political conquest. A conquest that silenced voices, erased symbols, and rewrote history. This is the story not of ignorance before Islam, but of usurpation by Islam. History is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it is rewritten by them. After the usurpation of Arabia, Islamic chroniclers faced a task to erase the memory of what had been lost and to sanctify the new order that had replaced it. Their tool was a single word: Jahiliyya, the age of ignorance. With this label, centuries of culture, pluralism, and prosperity were branded as darkness. With this label, Islam justified its monopoly as light. But this was not history. This was a propaganda. In Islamic memory, everything before Muhammad was called Jahiliyya. The poetry, the shrines, the sanctuaries, the symbols of worship, even the laws of tribes, all dismissed as foolishness. The word itself carried a sting: ignorance, savagery, barbarism. By branding the past as ignorant, the new faith crowned itself as salvation. But was Arabia truly ignorant? Was the Queen of Sheba ignorant? Were the engineers of the Marib Dam ignorant? Were the Jewish scholars of Yathrib ignorant? Were the Christian monks of Najran ignorant? Were the Sabian astronomers ignorant? Number. They were civilizations. They were voices of wisdom. They were diversity. Jahiliyya was not a description of reality. It was a political weapon. One of the first acts of the new order was to destroy the symbols of worship inside the Kaaba, not because they were superstition, but because they represented memory. Each symbol stood for a tribe, a culture, a voice. Each symbol was history engraved in stone and wood. By destroying them, Islam erased the visible proof of Arabia's pluralism. And by branding them as idols of Jahiliyya, it convinced the future that they were never legitimate to begin with. Arabia's greatest pride was its poetry. Poets preserved history, celebrated heroes, and passed wisdom across generations. But under the new order, pre-Islamic poetry was tainted. It was called poetry of ignorance. Many verses were censored, rewritten, or lost. The bards of Arabia, once the guardians of memory, were silenced by a narrative that declared, "Nothing before Islam had value." Another pillar of the Jahiliyya narrative was the demonization of Arabia's women. Islamic chroniclers claimed that before Muhammad, women were buried alive, treated as property, denied dignity. But history tells a different story. Women in pre-Islamic Arabia were poets, traders, even leaders. Khadija, Muhammad's own wife, was a wealthy merchant who hired him in her service. By branding the past as barbaric, Islam painted itself as liberator. But the truth is that Arabia's women already held voices that were later confined within the limits of Sharia. Yathrib, the city that welcomed Muhammad, was once a pluralist oasis. But in Islamic memory, its identity was rewritten. Its Jewish tribes became traitors. Its agreements became betrayals. Its name itself was erased, replaced with Medina, the city of the Prophet. The rewriting of Yathrib's history is the clearest example of Jahiliyya as propaganda. What was once tolerance was recast as treachery. What was once pluralism was branded as ignorance. And what of Yemen? The land of Sheba, of queens and engineers, of incense and alphabets. The land admired in scripture, visited by kings. In the Islamic narrative, Yemen's great civilizations were reduced to footnotes. Their gods dismissed as idols, their kingdoms forgotten, their prosperity erased. Yemen's brilliance was buried under the label of Jahiliyya. Its memory survives only in ruins and echoes. The tactic of branding the past as ignorance is not unique to Islam. Empires have always rewritten history to justify conquest. But in Arabia, the strategy was absolute. By declaring everything before Islam as Jahiliyya, the faith erased centuries of memory. It silenced rival voices. It monopolized identity. What was once a multicultural civilization became remembered as nothing but superstition. What was once wisdom became dismissed as darkness. Jahiliyya was not history. It was propaganda. Arabia was not ignorant before Islam. Arabia was pluralist, prosperous, multicultural. But when truth is rewritten, the past becomes a stranger. And so Arabia's real history was buried under the ink of those who called themselves its saviors. This is the greatest usurpation of all, not the destruction of temples, but the rewriting of memory. History does not only live in the past. The story of multiculturalist Arabia is not just a tale of ruins and lost civilizations. It is a mirror, a warning for the present. For today, in the West, we see the same spirit that once defined Arabia: pluralism, asylum, tolerance. And we see the same danger, the risk of surrender, the risk that tolerance, unchecked, becomes erasure. Just as Yathrib welcomed refugees fleeing Mecca, the West today welcomes those fleeing war, persecution, and oppression. Syrians, Afghans, Somalis, Nigerians, Iranians, Pakistanis all find in Europe and America what Arabia once offered: sanctuary. The West opens its borders not because it is weak, but because it believes in pluralism. It allows people to live as Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, atheists, freely, side by side. The West has become the new Yathrib, the new Arabia of asylum. In London, Paris, New York, Berlin, the same marketplace of beliefs that once filled Mecca now fills the modern city. A mosque stands beside a church, a synagogue down the street from a Hindu temple. Festivals of Diwali, Ramadan, Christmas and Hanukkah celebrated openly. The West, like Arabia before Islam, thrives on pluralism. If the Kaaba of Mecca was once a parliament of faiths, today its spirit lives in places like Speaker's Corner in London. Here, every idea is tested. Every creed is debated. Christians defend their gospel. Muslims preach dawah. Atheists challenge both. Feminists speak against patriarchy. Philosophers question everything. This is coexistence in action, noisy, chaotic, imperfect, but free. It is what Arabia once had. It is what Yathrib once protected. It is what Mecca once symbolized. But as in Arabia, so too here. The spirit of coexistence is threatened by the spirit of surrender. In Hyde Park, Christians once spoke boldly. Today, many are drowned out. Muslim activists gather in numbers, seeking not dialogue but dominance. They do not come for coexistence. They come for surrender. And beyond the park, in Europe's parliaments, governments bend further, laws softened to avoid offending Islam, textbooks rewritten to sanitize history, critics silenced under accusations of Islamophobia. Step by step, the West risks the same fate as Yathrib, giving too much ground until tolerance becomes silence and silence becomes submission. Islamic voices already frame the West as an age of Jahiliyya. They point to debates over gender, sexuality, and identity. Whether a man can become a woman, whether same-sex marriage should be allowed, whether freedom of choice should extend to all. What the West calls diversity, Islam brands confusion. What the West calls progress, Islam brands decadence. And just as Arabia's pluralism was labelled Jahiliyya, tomorrow the West may be remembered in Islamic history as the age of confusion and darkness, before Islam saved it. But here lies the irony. Islam, which claims it will save the West, cannot even save itself. It silences women instead of liberating them. It kills dissenters instead of debating them. It punishes blasphemy instead of answering criticism. It imposes conformity instead of nurturing diversity. The faith that erased Arabia's pluralism is not the saviour of civilization, it is the usurper of it. The West now stands at the same crossroads as Yathrib. Will it guard its pluralism? Will it protect coexistence with firmness? Or will it cave to endless demands, mistaking surrender for tolerance? If it surrenders, its story will be rewritten. Europe and America will be remembered not as civilizations of art, science and freedom, but as pagan lands of confusion, saved by Islam. History will repeat the lie of Jahiliyya, this time written about Paris, London, New York and Berlin. The story of multiculturalist Arabia is not just history, it is prophecy. Arabia once thrived on pluralism, but surrendered it to exclusivity. The West today thrives on pluralism, but risks the same surrender. The lesson is clear. Coexistence is civilization. Surrender is erasure. If the West forgets this, it will not only lose its future, it will lose its past, rewritten, as Arabia's was, into a lie of ignorance. We have walked the sands of Arabia and uncovered the truth long buried, a truth erased by conquerors, forgotten by generations, silenced by the word Jahiliyya. Arabia before Islam was not ignorance, it was multiculturalism, it was pluralism, it was civilization. But it fell, not because it was weak, but because it surrendered. It mistook tolerance for submission. It allowed coexistence to be devoured by exclusivity. This is the story of the usurpation of Arabia, and it is a warning to the West today. Christian bells ringing in Najran fade into silence. Sabian stargazers mapping constellations fade into darkness. Poets reciting verses in Mecca fade into blank parchment. Arabia was once alive with voices. Jews in Yathrib, Christians in Najran, Sabians under the stars, Zoroastrians in Hajar, Hanifs in desert caves. Each voice added to the symphony of a pluralist world. Each symbol in the Kaaba declared a tribe's presence, a people's belonging. But these voices were silenced, their memory erased, their symbols destroyed, their histories rewritten. What Islam called Jahiliyya was not ignorance, it was identity. And it was lost. In Mecca, the Kaaba ceased to be a parliament of faiths. It became a throne of monopoly. In Yathrib, pluralism collapsed into obedience. In Yemen, prosperity crumbled into erasure. Arabia became the first laboratory of Islamic exclusivity, the prototype of surrender, not coexistence. And from Arabia, this model would spread, conquering empires, rewriting histories, branding all that came before as ignorance. This cycle repeated across centuries. Egypt, we once land of pharaohs, gods and Coptic saints, rewritten as land of Islam. Persia, once the empire of Zoroaster and Cyrus, rewritten as a Muslim nation. North Africa, once home of Carthage, Berber kingdoms, Christian saints, erased into Islamic memory. Spain, once Al-Andalus, called a beacon of light, but only by forgetting the cultures it extinguished. Everywhere Islam went, the past was branded Jahiliyya, and everywhere pluralism gave way to surrender. And now the cycle approaches the West. The same spirit that usurped Arabia whispers in London, Paris, Berlin, New York. The West, like Arabia once, prides itself on tolerance, on freedom, on pluralism. But it bends too far. It silences its own critics. It censors its own voices. It mistakes surrender for coexistence. And as Arabia was once rewritten as ignorant before Islam, so too may Europe and America be rewritten as confused before Islam saved them. This is the danger. This is the prophecy. The lesson is not against coexistence. Coexistence is civilization. It allows many voices to live side by side, to challenge, to debate, to thrive. Arabia flourished because it coexisted. The West flourishes because it coexists. But when coexistence is abandoned for surrender, when one voice demands silence for all others, pluralism dies. This is the truth Arabia teaches us. This is the truth the West must remember. Arabia before Islam was not darkness. It was light, the light of diversity, of coexistence, of multicultural freedom. That light was usurped, erased, rewritten. If the West does not learn from Arabia's past, it too will be branded as ignorance, its brilliance forgotten, its pluralism erased. The truth deserves to be heard. The truth deserves to be remembered. This is the real history of Arabia. And this is the final warning for the West. History leaves us with one clear lesson. Islam, in its full practice, does not coexist. It does not share. It does not tolerate equals. It seeks to dominate, to silence, to paint every other belief as corrupt, ignorant, or lost. This is why Arabia's pluralism was branded as darkness. This is why Yathrib's tolerance was crushed into surrender. This is why Mecca's symbols of worship were destroyed. This is why Yemen's brilliance was erased. And this is why, today, the West must be warned. What Islam could not coexist with in Arabia, it cannot coexist with anywhere else. Its survival is built not on dialogue, but on surrender. Coexistence is civilization. Surrender is erasure. If the West forgets this truth, it too will be branded as confusion before Islam. Its own light rewritten as darkness, its voice silenced in the pages of history. The truth deserves to be heard. The truth deserves to be remembered. This is not just Arabia's story. This is the warning for our time. If you found this video very interesting, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share, so others can hear the truth that history tried to bury. Black Page Research, rewriting what was written in chains.